All right, we are going to the Norm Finkelstein. I'm laughing because of his facial expression. Norm Finkelstein was on Breaking Points again, and he is now responding to some of the statements that have been made by Bill Maher. Bill Maher has been terrible on this issue with Israel and Gaza. This is what people have to understand. I thought he's been terrible on a lot of issues, not just this one, just politically. I feel like Bill Maher looks out for his class and his bottom line. I don't think Bill Maher cares about people who are poor, working class, none of that shit. I just really don't. I think he looks out for himself. So Norm Finkelstein comes in here and he has some things to say to Bill Maher. Let's see if Bill Maher will actually invite him on the show. Do you think?
First one that I wanted to get you to take a look at was a recent monologue from Bill Maher. Let's take a listen to a bit of that.
But eventually, everybody comes to an accommodation, except the Palestinians. Was it unjust that even a single Arab family was forced to move upon the founding of the Jewish state? Yes, but it's also not rare. And no one knows more about being pushed off land than the Jews, including being almost wholly kicked out of every Arab country they once lived in.
Pause. So you see what Bill Maher's doing? He's saying because it's not rare, it's okay for it to happen. So this just goes to show you, because let's think about this, guys. Slavery at the time wasn't rare in the United States, but it also wasn't right.
Yes, TikTok fans, ethnic cleansing happened both ways. In Fiddler on the Roof, the family is always moving to stay one step ahead of the Cossacks, but they deal with it. When they're leaving Anatevka, they say, hey, it wasn't so great anyway. Nobody was a bigger colonizer than the Muslim army that swept out of the Arabian desert and took over much of the world in a single century. And they didn't do it by asking. There's a reason Saudi Arabia's flag is a sword. Arafat was offered 95% of the West Bank and said no. The Palestinian people should know your leaders and the useful idiots on college campuses who are their allies are not doing you any favors by keeping alive the river to the sea myth. I mean,
this guy is, I'm sorry you have to listen to this, guys, but this guy is absolutely horrible. Absolutely horrible.
Where do you think Israel is going? Spoiler alert, nowhere.
So the sort of core of the point he is making is Jews got kicked out of a lot of countries too, and it's effectively time for Palestinians to get over it and move on.
Well, just as a general point, I find it rather amusing when I hear Bill Maher pontificating about, if you see the longer clip, about Byzantium, about the Roman Empire, about Muslim expansion. He knows as much about these topics as Joy Behar. The only difference between him and Ms. Behar is she reads her factoids off of index cards while he reads them off of a monitor. And neither of them is, in my opinion, particularly funny.
What's funny about Norm Finkelstein is that he says what I think he says what a lot of people are thinking, but we may be afraid to say it. Well, he says it. Norm Finkelstein has no filter.
And I find it in very poor taste in the midst of a genocide, making these rather impoverished attempts at humor, where half the audience laughing uproariously sounds as if they were paid to laugh. But let's leave all that aside and let's get to the factual matters. Here are the facts. The Palestinians on the Zionist project, I'm not going to go through the whole history, I promise your listeners. The Zionist project begins roughly at the end of the 19th century. Their aim was to establish a Jewish state in Palestine Palestine was not empty, it became obvious to the indigenous population that the realization of the Zionist enterprise to create a Jewish state would at minimum reduce them to second-class citizens in their own place of birth, or at worst, result in their expulsion. And the Zionist movement coined a locution they called a transfer. They didn't want to use the vulgar, gross term expulsion, so they called it the transfer. And as Israel's leading historian, who, by the way, at this point is extremely right-wing, his name is Benny Morris, and you'll see him in all the right-wing talk shows like Coleman Hughes and others. Benny Morris said, and now I'm quoting him, the idea of transfer or expulsion, the idea of transfer was inbuilt and inevitable in Zionism. Okay? Yep. Now, it happens I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Zionism. I know about the subject, but I never belabored the terminology because sometimes I think it obfuscates the critical facts rather than enlightening them. Sort of like nowadays when Palestinian supporters talk about settler colonialism. I don't find this kind of terminology enlightening. I think it obscures more than it enlightens. But as a factual matter, as Benny Morris said, the idea of transfer or expulsion was inbuilt and inevitable in Zionism.
And this is one of the pieces about that JFK article that was revealed as well. One of the problems that JFK actually had with nationalism of Israel and the Zionist movement is because that was exactly part of the plan. He saw where that was headed, and that's why he did not support that. So it's important that people understand from the very beginning of the Zionist movement, the expulsion of the people on the land was already a part of the movement that was already established from the get-go. And I continue to echo that because you have to understand when people make this statement of, well, on October 7th, they are totally purposely forgetting about what happened before October 7th. So I say this because it is not always because of Hamas. The expulsion that was laid out in the Zionist project from the very beginning, during that time, there was no Hamas. So it was always a part of the plan. So I'm telling you this, so when people give you that narrative, guys, and they say, well, yes, they had to occupy them because of Hamas, I want you to remember that so you can push back on that and let them know that it was already a part of the original plan before Hamas even existed.
Okay. And so the indigenous population of Palestine, the Arab, later they came to define themselves as Palestinian, but the Arab-Palestinian population of Palestine naturally revolted against that prospect. In fact, Benny Morris writes, remember, he's now a right-wing historian, but Benny Morris writes that the driving force, the motor force of opposition to Zionism was the prospect that the indigenous population was going to be expelled if this idea were realized. Now, skipping far ahead and not to tilt the scale in my direction, but just to bring us to an end before this one question consumes your whole program. Come 1948, a war breaks out. I'm not going to talk about who's right and who's wrong in the course of the war, but now, as David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of the state of Israel, said, he quoted the famous French expression, which is still quoted, when in war, do as in war. Namely, here is a prospect. Now we have the opportunity to realize the Zionist dream, and the population from the area that became Israel, 90% of the population from the area that became Israel was expelled.
So Ben-Gurion, who we talked about in the JFK article, remember he's referenced multiple times in that article by Rick Sterling.
Exactly what you would expect, given what the ideology was, and an opportunity now availed itself. and they became the Palestinian refugees. So now Bill Maher says, well, basically he says, it's a done deal, get over it.
Yep.
I'm not going to pass a judgment on that. Now, you know, Crystal, and if you don't mind, I'd rather look at you than I look at myself, because I'm more concerned about persuading you than persuading myself. I'm already persuaded. And body language is sometimes indicative, so I'd like to look at you, and where I see you're demurring, I'll stop and we'll continue. So he says, basically, get over it. Now, you know, Crystal, let's say you were fired from a job wrongly. What do you expect your friends to do? Do you expect them to support you? Or do you expect them to say, Crystal, get over it?
I would hope they would support me.
Exactly. So there is an obligation, a kind of moral obligation among those not directly the victim to support those to the extent they're able to rectify a wrong. That's, to me, a moral responsibility.
Especially for those who actually care about the wellness of other people. The problem, I think, with Bill Maher is I don't think Bill Maher cares about anybody but himself. He hasn't really shown me anything else otherwise, based on what I've seen from Bill Maher. This is the same guy who sat on his program and just openly used the N-word. Now, yes, he did come back and apologize for that, but that just goes to show you just how privileged Bill Maher is. And he still got to keep his program. Okay? Just think about that. But that shows you just how privileged he is. Like he has a lot of money. He used to doing what he want and saying what he want and not being held accountable a lot of the times too. He made a statement one time before that he actually doesn't see a homeless problem in Los Angeles. But that's probably because you're not really looking around. I mean, are you getting in a limo every time you leave your house? Probably. Are you actually getting in your car and driving around to these areas and actually looking at the city or going to those parts of the city where there are people sleeping outside in all those tent communities? Probably not. I mean, if you're eating at like the Ritz-Carlton, if you're eating at these fancy places and you're only going to certain parts where people have money, you're probably not going to see those things. And see, though, that's the thing. People like Bill, he only worry about Bill.
And then you might come to the conclusion, you know what, this is going nowhere. And I hope this person understands it's going nowhere and move on, okay? The fact of the matter is, and I have to tell you, I watched the Bill Maher segment this morning, and several times I had to just, take a breath, because he's such an ignorant sack of shit. It just...
No filter. No filter.
nauseates me when I'm listening to this. He hasn't a clue what the history is. He really doesn't know anything. This is the reason Bill Maher doesn't want kids to go to college. He says it's a waste of time. Yeah, in college you learn that before you speak your mind, you should actually know a few facts. You're supposed to read books, not just have note cards passed to you. So what are the facts? And I'm perfectly willing now to say to Bill Maher to his face, if you disagree with me, have me on your program. Have me on your program, and we'll go through it step by step. Already as early as 1976. Now, if I'm not mistaken, you were probably born around that time.
A little bit later, but yes.
Okay, later.
Crystal's like, don't be revealing my age, Norm.
So before you were born, and I'd like you to sort of let that sink in. You're an adult woman already. You have children. I'm talking about before you were born. Already in 1976, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which at that point was a representative organization of the Palestinian people, was supporting two states on the June 1967 border. They were supporting the compromise. They were already giving up before you were born. the representative organization of the Palestinians, universally recognized, the PLO. They already were ready to compromise. They gave up, and I hope this will sink into the minds of your listeners. It's impossible that they'll sink into the mind of Bill Maher because there isn't a mind. There's a blank space that's filled in with desperate attempts of being clever and funny for his paid listeners.
Look, I gotta tell you guys something really quick. Some of the people, like some of these comedians or whatever, or hosts that people say, they're so funny, they're hilarious. And then like, I would listen to them and sometimes I'm like, I don't really think they're that funny. I've thought that about Bill Maher. I've thought that about Amy Schumer. I never thought Amy Schumer was really that funny. I didn't understand that. This woman was getting like her own special on Netflix. They were offering her millions of dollars. And I'm like, I would listen to this and watch this and I get a chuckle here or there, but it's not like if somebody's paying you $20 million for a Netflix special, I expect to be falling out my damn seat, laughing my ass off. And the thing is, you just don't. You don't. It just, I'm like, you're really not that funny. You're really just not. You know, so I wonder how some of them like actually got the roles that they got because I don't know. I don't know. You got to think about the school of comedy that I grew up with. So to me, a lot of these people just aren't that funny.
But for everybody else, before you were born, the Palestinians had already compromised. They had already moved on. They had given up on 80% of Palestine, the area that became the state of Israel. And they had resigned themselves, reconciled themselves to the prospect of a state just on the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. But the whole area that became Israel, before you were born, they had acquiesced in that reality. Now, there is a question about the fate and future of the Palestinian refugees, those who were expelled. And I will grant, because I am an old-fashioned believer in truth, and as a radical, I like to quote the better part of the radical tradition that says the truth is revolutionary. Namely, there is no contradiction between the truth and having revolutionary or radical aspirations. So I'm not afraid of the truth. It's not like truth is the enemy of revolution or truth is the enemy of a radical transformation of our society and our world. So it is true that this refugee question has been a gray area. But if you look at all the negotiations, and I've studied it very closely, in all the negotiations, it was clear that the Palestinians were willing to, or the representative organizations, were willing to make drastic, colossal compromises on the question of the return of the Palestinian refugees.
See, that's the part that's important for people to hear. That part right there. You know, so Alan Dershowitz needs to hear that like they were offered a two-state solution multiple times and they rejected it. You know, it's like being denied the right to return is some crazy, wild shit like that. We don't have that happen to us. If you were to move, you grew up in Texas, and let's say you moved to Washington State, imagine being told you're not allowed to return to Texas. It's crazy, wild shit when you think about it, right? But that's exactly, this is the thing. Like, I want you to have that comparison. I mean, obviously you can travel outside the United States if you wanted to become an American expat. And let's say you lived in another country, and then suppose you're told you're not allowed to come back to the United States, but now you're going across the water, right? So let's just keep it simple and remain inland. So just imagine that you could not return to your home state. It's just crazy. It's really wild.
So any honest reckoning of the factual record will show you that the Palestinians had already compromised, had already given up the aspirations of one state from the river to the sea. Now, if there were any doubts, just let me give you a few examples. So in the 1980s, we're now going ahead, okay? We're going from 1976 to in the early 1980s. The Palestinians were making it very clear they were ready to compromise on two states in historic Palestine. Their state would only constitute 20%. The Israelis began to panic because they were afraid that international public opinion would force them to relinquish control of the West Bank and Gaza, which they were determined to keep. And so an Israeli political scientist, his name is Avner Yaniv, very mainstream fellow. He's since passed. Actually, I think I'm the only one still alive. Everybody involved in the conflict is dead already. He said, what the Israelis feared, and I'd like this expression hopefully to sink into the minds of you listeners as well. What the Israelis feared was the Palestinian peace offensive. The Palestinian peace offensive. They were terrified that the Palestinians were becoming too moderate, and therefore pressure would be exerted by the international community to force on Israel its withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza to its pre-June 1967 borders. So what did Israel do? Israel fabricated in June 1982 an excuse to invade Lebanon. Why did they want to invade Lebanon? Because that's where the PLO was located at the time, the Representative Palestinian Organization. They wanted to destroy the PLO, not because it was radical, not because it wanted to create a state from the river to the sea. They wanted to destroy the PLO because it was too moderate. The Palestinian peace offensive, okay? And in the course of that attempt to liquidate the excessively moderate PLO, Israel killed between 15 and 20,000 Palestinian and Lebanese, overwhelmingly civilians.
Now, if I remember correctly, this was actually the conflict that Ronald Reagan actually intervened and called for a ceasefire. If I remember correctly, I thought it was 1982. And at that point in time, it was not popular for him to do that. There weren't, like the protests that we're having right now across the world, it wasn't like that during that time. It was not a popular decision for him to make, but he made it. So Ronald Reagan on this particular issue of calling for a ceasefire was to the left of Joe Biden right now. It's insane. It's insane. But he said, nope, we got to end it. Got to call for a ceasefire. The people are starting to have outrage. There's a public outcry. You cannot continue to do this. Now, Israel has killed more people in Gaza today, or since October 7th. We'll start with just October 7th. There's more before that. But since October 7th, than they did, I believe, in Lebanon. And remember what I told you, the numbers are actually higher than what they're saying. They don't have all the body count. There are still bodies underneath the rubble that have not been pulled out yet. So when we get to the end of this thing, there's no telling how many people are going to be a part of the death toll. So just keep that in mind. What they're saying, 25,000 now, it could be actually 50. That's the point I'm trying to get at. So Reagan came in and said, that's it. Nope. Ceasefire now. He was to the left of Joe Biden back in the 80s compared to what Joe Biden is not willing to do now. This is crazy. Think about that.
As a matter of fact, this last Israeli genocide in Gaza, it for the first time exceeded the amount of death and destruction since the Lebanon War in 1982. People already have completely forgotten And what was the cause of the war? Why did Israel kill 15 to 20,000 Palestinian and Lebanese, overwhelmingly civilians? Because of, and Bill Maher, I'll be happy to come on your program, take out Avner Yaniv's book and shove it in front of your face. Now, I know that will be torture. I understand that will be torture, not the phrase, but having to look at a book. Having to look at a book. Now, maybe you think you're protected under the 8th Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, we'll go through that in court. But yes, the Palestinian peace offensive. Now, come 1987, the Palestinian...
We're actually going to stop there because I'm pressed for time. But if you want to see the full segment here, it's on Breaking Points. Norm Finkelstein shreds Bill Maher's Israel defense. Plus, I think this is definitely a pretty long clip so far. But yeah. But guys, I'm going to make you laugh before we leave here because like I told you we're going to laugh tonight, okay? Let me go to some of the comments here. Thank you for the super chat, 100% Black Roke. I super appreciate you, Sabby. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Jacqueline says, Bill Maher is worse than Dershowitz because he sounds reasonable and not deranged. Spark Joy says, was Maher an Epstein friend? I don't know. Good question. Cody says the Dakotas are banned from forming as a tribe again in the state of Minnesota. I did not know that, Cody. That's wild as well. Thank you, Sparky. Amy Schumer is Chuck Schumer's niece. That's right. She steals her lines from other comedians, so anything she says that is even mildly amusing is plagiarized. Wow. Thank you for that.